Hello, I'm Father Joe Gabala, pastor of St. Malachy Catholic Church, and this is the second of our Advent series. Our Advent series is a continuation of our previous series because I have chosen for Advent to talk about the saints of the Advent season. Our second saint we'll talk about reminds me of when I was a little child. I think I was in the second grade at the time, and it was a Christmas Eve. And it was very snowy, and I remember hearing jingle bells outside the window, and I thought for certain Santa Claus was coming. Now, back then, they didn't have Saturday evening masses. They just had the midnight mass and the masses on Sunday, and my mother would faithfully go to midnight mass, and my dad would cook the Christmas dinner. And that dinner was served at 2 a.m. Christmas Day. My relatives would come over from next door, my grandpa, my aunts, my cousins, and my mother would come home, and Dad would have all the kielbasa and all the gołąbki and all the pierogi, and it was all set up on the table. And we would have a feast at 2 a.m., and we would open up the Christmas presents. And I told my dad, I heard Santa come, I heard the bells. Well, as one grows up, one realizes it's probably my dad ringing those jingle bells. But if someone ever asks you, is Santa Claus real? The answer is absolutely yes, he is. Because Santa Claus is just an old Dutch way of saying Saint Nicholas. And Saint Nicholas, whose feast day is December the 6th, is definitely a great saint to talk about in the Advent season. St. Nicholas was born around the year 300 in what's modern-day Turkey. His family had money and got Nicholas a very good education. They were all Christians. During the Diocletian persecution, Nicholas did spend some time in jail for the crime of being a Christian, but then after Diocletian died and Constantine became the emperor, Christianity became legal. And Nicholas, being very devout and very prayerful and very well educated, was elected the bishop of his town. Now, he was a very generous bishop and a very devout bishop. But there's one particular story about him, which I think we should know, and it's a story that you should tell your children, your grandchildren, the first visit of St. Nicholas. And the story goes like this. St. Nicholas was on his way to celebrate midnight mass. He was riding in a cart pulled by a mule. He's going from his house to the church. And he knew one of his parishioners was very, very poor. He didn't have enough food to feed his 3 daughters. He didn't even have enough fuel to put a fire in his fireplace. He had even burned his shutters in the last attempt to have a fire. And while it doesn't get that cold in southern Turkey, it gets cold enough. And inside that poor house was this man and his 3 daughters. Well, Nicholas, I mentioned, was a very wealthy man, rode up to the window and took a bag of coins and threw it through the window. These were silver coins, and they landed in the empty, cold fireplace. The next morning, the man got up, and there was this bag of coins. It was a miracle, he said, and he was able to feed his family again and have a fire again and take care of everyone again. Now, when the artists in the eastern part of the church would draw icons, which is a particular type of church picture of Nicholas, they often had him in his bishop's robes throwing the bag through the window. Now, let's step back for a minute. Time marches on. The faith spreads north into what's now Russia. So we're now in the 800s and the 900s. Well, people back then, you got to remember, didn't have historical perspective, and most people didn't understand that people lived differently with different clothes and different customs in previous times. Most people just assumed it was always the way it was, how they were living. So when the artists, by that time in what's now Moscow and Kiev, would draw the painting of St. Nicholas, they just looked around and they said, well, it can't be a cart, because no one would have a cart in the wintertime. They'd have a sled. So now Nicholas is in a sled, and they'd say, well, no one would ever burn their shutters. You'd freeze to death on the first night. So the shutters are there and they're closed. So how does the bishop get the coins into the fireplace? We have to climb on the roof and drop them down the chimney. Yeah. And then when the faith goes farther north into Lapland and Finland and Sweden, and the artists draw pictures of St. Nicholas, they make a few other alterations. Well, you don't have a sled pulled by a horse or a mule. Up here, they're going to be pulled by what? Reindeer, of course. So depending upon the time in history and who's drawing the painting, the original story of the bishop is altered by artists who were trying to explain what Nicholas was doing in terms of the culture that people were living in. But Bishop Nicholas, St. Nicholas, his first gift that he ever gives is that bag of coins to that poor man and his 3 daughters. But I have to tell you something. There's a carol, which I particularly like, Jolly Old St. Nicholas. Well, Nicholas had a lot of wonderful virtues, but I don't know if he was all that jolly, because he attended the First Council of Nicaea, called by Emperor Constantine itself. And the Constantine, they were dealing with a heresy called Arianism. There was a deacon named Arius who proposed that Christ was not born divine, but gradually became divine during his life. Well, the bishops debated, and they said, no, he was all divine and all human. And when Nicholas was arguing with the deacon Arius himself, well, as the story goes, he decked him. But that part you might want to leave out when telling your kids. But St. Nicholas is real. And as we think about Christmas that's coming, of course, it is the time to think about the poor and the needy and be as generous as we can toward them.